Welcome to the Jefferson County Public Library's virtual program, A Community Conversation. And tonight we're going to talk about race. I have some questions prepared for tonight, but I do hope that this will be an interactive conversation. So if you're here tonight, I hope that you will type your questions into chat. I think there might even be an option for maybe raising your hand and unmuting yourself and asking the question. Betty and I would really like this to be a conversation. So let's see. So I want to tell you a little bit about these conversations. These are held the third Wednesday of every month. This month, obviously, we're talking about race. Next month, we're going to talk about hunger and homelessness. And in December, we're going to talk about language justice, and we're planning into 2021. So check out jeffcolibrary.org for all of that program information. We have things from story time to call-in meditation and everything in between. But now, let's talk about some race. First, a quick intro. So I'm Jennifer Redding. I'm the Manager of Diversity and Inclusion and the Arvada location at the Jefferson County Public Library. And I was introduced to Betty Hart on a Sunday afternoon in mid-July. My mother had invited me to join her for her virtual women's group based in Golden, Colorado. And they had scheduled a special meeting in which Betty was invited to share her perspectives and to engage in a collective dialogue about race and racism. And Betty was amazing. She talked with us, a group of white women and a couple of husbands, ranging in age from mid-30s to mid-80s. And she engaged with us for 2.5 hours. It was spectacular. I couldn't wait to continue the conversation. So I reached out to Betty and said, hey, would you be interested in continuing this conversation in a library hosted program? And she enthusiastically said yes. And so here we are today. So thank you all for coming. So Betty, how about if we just jump right in? We'll learn about you through this process, right? So let's start off with the first question.
Oh, wait, before we do the first question.
Oh, yeah.
I've got to do my land acknowledgement before we start.
Thank you, Betty.
So, hey, everyone. I am Betty. Thank you for coming. Would love to see your faces. And it's so good to see so many people I know and already have deep affection for. I expect to feel that way about more of you as this conversation goes on. But I am sitting on the lands that were formerly owned by the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, the Ute, and the Oceti Shayokin. And so I would love to know where you are. If you've never done a land acknowledgement, if you just Google land acknowledgement, you can put in your address and you can then tell us what tribal lands you are resting on right now. We would love to have that. It's a really big thing for me to make sure that we honor those. And so I've put mine in the chat, but some of you came in late so you couldn't see it. So please feel free to put it in the chat. We really appreciate that. Now, Jennifer, you can ask me a question.
All right. Well, we'll do a little softball one. Why do you think it can be challenging to talk about race?
Probably because people haven't been doing it their whole lives. Probably because it's different. And because I think the number one reason it's hard to talk about race is the fear of offense, both perceived fear that you might actually offend someone and the very real fear because you have said something at some point in time that did offend. And so, my advice to people who want to have these conversations, and I do recommend everyone does, is to give yourself permission to speak in draft. And when we speak in draft, we recognize that it's not the final say, it's the beginning. And if you've ever rewritten a paper, a text, an email, you know that the first thing you wrote might not have been as prolific as where you landed. And so if you give yourself permission to speak in draft, that means when you make a mistake, you can acknowledge it because it's in draft. It doesn't mean anything about who you are. It just means that's the first version that came out. And then you actually give yourself permission and the person who perhaps said something to you that was also in draft to be able to do the same. And I think most of us can move forward if we recognize that the thing that we said may not be the end. It's just the beginning.
Thank you. Yes.
That's amazing.
All right. I want to make sure that folks have an opportunity. We're here until 7:30, so we have lots of time. Like I said, Betty was engaged with us for 2.5 hours. I couldn't believe it. It was pretty spectacular. So If folks have questions, go ahead and pop them in the chat. Like I said, I do have some prepared. Here's another one that I hear often in my work. What is the correct terminology? Is it Black, African American, people of color? Help us out there.
Yeah, it's a great question. And fun fact, there's no one right answer. Every single person will have a different point of view. There are people who hate the phrase POC, and there are people who hate the phrase Black, and there are people who hate the phrase African American. There are Mexicans who hate Latinx, and, we can go on. So there's no one thing that fits all, I think is important to say. And also, every time I answer a question, I'm only answering from my perspective. By no means do I represent all Black people, all people of color, all women, all Americans, all artists. I can continue giving you labels, but I'm really representing me. But what I will say in terms of dealing with Black versus African American is that African American should be the default until someone corrects you. And here's why. Studies have shown that there is a bias when we hear Black. When people hear Black, they often think thieves, criminals, thugs. When they hear African American, they think lawyers, doctors, presidents. I can't explain why that is, but it's out there. So if I were you, I would defer to African American until the person says, I like to be called Black. Or you could try something really radical. How would you like to be referred? And just ask.
That's great. Thanks, Betty. And there was, I think there's a question here in the chat. What if we're not sure? This is from Liz. What if we're not sure the people we're talking to do not acknowledge that we're in draft mode, that we're in draft?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Liz. And the fact is, considering I probably just introduced that concept to you, I would say 99.9% of the people you're talking to are going to have no idea about this idea of speaking in draft, right? And so I think, one, you have to give yourself permission to make mistakes along the way, right? If you've ever watched a baby try to walk, and I'm pretty sure all of us have, whether it's your own child or someone else's on a video, you saw that the kid didn't succeed the first time, right? And some of us, if we're honest, we laughed. We laughed when they fell, right? And others of us encouraged, and other of us ran and grabbed them, right? So when someone first begins doing something, it's not natural. It's not easy. It's not comfortable. So I think you have to give yourself that permission. And then when someone else is offended, then you have a choice in how you respond. For me, the first time someone says I'm offended, my job as an empathetic person is to apologize. It's not to justify why I was right first. It's to try to repair the harm. That's me. That's what I think is how people should act and operate. Once there's been some harm repair, harm reduction done, then I can say, I didn't mean it that way, or I probably should have said it this way, or I need to think more before I speak, right? Any of those things that are true. So I don't think there's, again, like a one size fits all, but I also think that if you're entering into the conversation, it wouldn't be a bad idea to say to someone, I heard this really cool thing, and it's how I'm working, which is that I'm speaking in draft, which means the first time I say it, it's really only the first draft, and it may not be as strong or as polished or whatever that is for me as it will be later. But I just want you to know that I'm speaking in draft, and I welcome you to do the same. And so you can start to have that conversation with the people that you're, in your circle, and know that that's what you're doing, as opposed to going, but in my heart, I'm speaking in draft. Why didn't they know? Well, we didn't tell them. So that's why they didn't know. And so they just heard what they heard, right? Great question.
Yeah.
Thanks, Liz.
Yeah, thanks for that, Liz. And remember, you can always pop your questions into the chat. Here's one I hear from time to time. I hear it from kids. I hear it from adults. But I'm colorblind. I don't see color. What does that do for you?
Besides put tension in my shoulders, it's, on the right, wrong day, it has any number of responses. It can take me straight to anger. It can make me laugh out loud. Because the reality is, one, unless you are medically colorblind, you can see color. And so whenever people say they aren't colorblind, they're colorblind, they don't see color, I always kind of have to break this down. And so if there are people who are white or identifying as white, I will say, when your friend gets a suntan, do you notice? And everyone says, yeah. I'll say, then you can see color, right? It's really simple. But then it's about deepening the walk of why people say that. And so I'll ask questions. Many people will say, well, I was taught that it's wrong to see color. And so that's why I do this. I was taught that we're supposed to see everyone as the same. And so this idea might have come from a positive place or a seemingly positive place, but it has a lot of negative ramifications. For example, if you all look on the screen, you can see that my friend AJ has on multicolors, right? One of the colors that's prominent there is orange. If I looked at that and said, it's a top, really? No, it's not. It's many different things, right? And so when you don't acknowledge that someone is African American, when you don't acknowledge someone is Asian, if you don't acknowledge someone is Latinx or Latino or Latina or Mexican or Colombian, then you're denying who we are. And so the best of intentions don't change that fact. And so it becomes really hurtful. Because how can you not see this gorgeous brown skin? How do you not see it? So we want you to see it. Kids see it. You might remember as a kid, you did see it. And then an adult probably told you to stop that. That's problematic. Your kid self knew. Just the way we identify people in all kinds of different ways, that there's nothing intrinsically right or wrong with identifying someone based on size or color or beauty or any number of things. It's what you do with that information that can be problematic.
And AJ did pop a question into the chat. Can you see that there? Do you want me to read it, or do you want to read it?
I can't see it. How do you voice your concerns in what you believe to be an unsafe environment, such as a class where being a person of color or being PC isn't the subject, or a place around people you don't know? Ooh, AJ, what a great question. I would say it's kind of a multi-tiered response. If it's just talking about to one person, like going to the instructor afterward and saying, hey, I'd like to talk to you. There was a moment that made me uncomfortable. Are you willing to listen? That's one thing. It's a very different thing if something offensive happens in the class, during the class, and you're asking, how do you navigate that? So I would say, first of all, every person has the right to navigate it their own way. Right? To the people on the call who are white, I would say if you are choosing to be an ally, it's your job to actually speak up first. The AJs and the Michaels and the Bettys of the world shouldn't have to fight the battle when they are in the minority in the room. That's not a fair fight. Doesn't mean we can't do it. Doesn't mean we can't win, but it's not cool. And that's where it begins to move into the space of, are you trying to actively be anti-racist versus racist? And I just bring that up because I'm in the midst, I'm not even finished with it yet, but I am in the midst of Dr. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And I think the most provocative statement in there is that there's no such thing as non-racist, right? Which is where America wants to be. Like, I didn't do anything wrong. I don't have a robe. I'm not racist. And what I love that Dr. Kendi says is that non-racist isn't an option. You're either racist, and that's all of us, period, regardless of skin color, or you're an anti-racist. And what I love about what he says, which is so powerful, is that racism isn't who you are, it's what you do. So in the scenario that AJ described, if I'm in a room where I don't know where the politics are of the people, I don't know, all I know is that they said something that's incorrect, said something that's harmful, said something that's derogatory. For Betty, I'm going to speak up because that's who I am. That's just my personality. And so I would literally stop the conversation, and AJ knows me well enough to know that's true. And I would just have a moment and I would just say, hi, I don't know why we're using that terminology anymore, but it was always offensive. It's definitely offensive now. And I'm going to go ahead and request that you all stop. And that's me. I just put it out there. I don't have to be rude about it. I'm just going to put it out there. And now if we want to have a conversation, great. But for me, the number one thing is just getting the behavior to stop. so that I can continue in that space, in a positive way. But to your point, AJ, about safe spaces, and certainly for people of color, there are so many spaces that are not safe. A lot of people will simply choose to retreat and then discuss it in the safety of their own circle, right? And I think that that's a fair thing as well. If you don't know the safety of the room and you're already in an emotionally vulnerable place, I'm not asking you to put yourself more at risk, right? You have to know where you are. And on the right, wrong day, you just can't. That's legit. And so you have to decide and govern for yourself how to do that. Some people prefer to do it in writing, because that way they can express it and then the person can receive it and then they can choose to engage in the conversation. Because right now our country is just a mess, right? And there's such sensitivity that if you even say offense, people are going to automatically go to, you thought I was a racist. And you're like, I didn't even say that, right? And so there's a lot of complications that make the conversation harder than it should have to. And I'm happy to talk with you because you, of course, have my cell. So if you want to talk more about more specifics, we can do that.
So kind of a follow-up on that, Gia has asked, recently I understood that the new Supreme Court nominee does not believe the N-word in the workplace makes the environment hostile. And how do you feel about her assessment?
Wow. Well, I'm grateful that I have not been in the news media space to be able to read more about that, though I definitely will read more about that and see what it is that she said in her interviews. Gia, it's 100% hostile. It's 100% hostile. I could come up with 10 other words that are just as hostile. They're all hostile. There is never a reason to use the N-word, period, unless you are a performer who is being required to say the word as part of a play or film. That's about it. I don't think teachers who are teaching specific literature get the right to say it. No, it's just not appropriate. It's just a horrible thing to say. It is harmful beyond belief. No one should ever say it. And for anyone who claims they are woke and think they have the right to say it, or my best friend is Black, so I get to say it, is deceiving themselves. It's a no. It's always a no. No.
Thank you for that unequivocal answer. And Liz followed up with, and it doesn't have to be a fight. And I think this is in reference to AJ's point. It can be standing up for someone in a plain way and pointing something out that the person who's being racist might not even be aware of. And the person of color shouldn't have to do it for themselves, as you said, Betty.
Yeah. And Jennifer, before you go to a next question, I literally know like a bunch of people in this room, a third of the room. I want to just go ahead and offer this to you all because writing is wonderful, but some of you may not love writing. And if we think about different modalities, that may not be everyone's preferred way. So if you do have a question that you would like to state, you could simply raise your hand. If you click on the participants button down below, there'll be a list of things, including raise hand. And so you can do that and we will see that and we are happy to call on you. I think it's worth noting because we are presuming that this is a safe space and everyone in the room knows how to govern themselves accordingly, that there are 3 hosts. If you do decide, hey, wouldn't it be fun to say the N-word or something inflammatory just to see what happens? The response will be that you will be muted and or removed from the room. The hope is that we won't be doing that because that seems silly. You came for a reason, but it's worth mentioning that we aren't going to just have people be obnoxious for no good reason.
Yeah, and I think the way to do that is you can ask to unmute yourself. I'm still in the Zoom learning process.
No, it's already there, Jennifer. They've got it. Liz already raised her hand.
Perfect. Yay.
Oh, Liz.
Liz, go for it.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to clarify my comment. I was talking to a friend of mine on Facebook today, and she's a person of color. She has a sort of unusual name. And in a class, she was saying that her professor was always mispronouncing her name. And she corrected him every single time. She corrected him. And then it seemed like he kind of thought it was cute to, pretend not to understand how to say. So she said every day for the whole semester. And I just thought it would have been so easy. She didn't want to risk herself even more for getting a bad grade or something if she really took this guy to task. But that's just like an example of how white people can use their privilege and just, it doesn't have to be like a big fight. It can just be like, standing up for that person and saying, it's not that hard to pronounce her name. Why don't we all try to see if we can do it? Or, going to him during office hours or something like that. I just wanted to point out that, like using our privilege as white people, for those of us here who are white, it doesn't have to be like a fight necessarily. It can be just small things, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz.
Thank you. And there was a great question. Patricia asked, what does the word woke mean?
Oh, Patricia, because you asked, I went ahead and Googled it for you, and then I'm going to tell you what I really think about it, but I'll give you what, Google says. Of course, it's the past tense of wake, and it also is an adjective meaning alert to injustice in society, especially racism. For example, we need to stay angry and stay woke. So that's what the phrase is. I, however, have a different point of view. I think that over 90% of the time when someone says they are woke, which they mean to say that they are aware of the cause, they are down for the cause, they are with us in the struggle, etc. That's what it means. 90% of the time, if you have to say you're woke, you're not. And I do start off with the first part of the definition. It is past tense. Why would any of us want to be past tense? It's a question I ask. So for me, woke is a pejorative, but there's a huge amount of people who would be really excited with you to say that you're woke and to tell you that you're woke and to be complimented when you say you're woke. But yeah, when white people say they're woke, I'm like, okay, are you? And do you know what you just said?
I like that clarification.
All right, Christine said, yes, and one thing I love about even ex-Kendi's approach is encouraging those who are being allies to be thoughtful about not shaming those whom they are pointing out blind spots. Yes, a great way to help people stay out of defensive mode. And I love you said that, Christine, because the truth is all of us have blind spots and all of us have bias. There's not a single person who's alive who doesn't have bias. The only people whose bias may not be evident are those who are in comas, in which case we are hoping and praying that they will return to a place of bias. Just want you to hear that, because you might have heard people say, oh, I don't have any bias. It's a lie. The only people who don't have bias are the dead. Everyone else has bias. It is a natural part of our brains. And so it is much easier for you to see my bias and for me to see your bias. That's just kind of the way it works. And so if we're really trying to help people, rather than being really indignant and going, you know what, Marcy? Yeah, no, don't do that. It's just not a cool way of being an ally. Helping other people to be defensive doesn't work. Yes, you can unmute. We're sorry that you don't have the raise hand feature. Go for it.
That's okay. Hi, Betty. Yeah, this is Wes and Janet. And going back to the N word, I've had to say that on stage. We did To Kill a Mockingbird, and I was the prosecutor. And anytime I've had to do that, I've always felt really bad, obviously. And I always make a point during rehearsal of getting with the person I'm saying it to and saying, this is because it's in the script and it's not how I feel, and so on and so forth. So am I going overboard in trying to clear the air beforehand, do you think?
What do you mean by overboard?
Well, should I just let it go? Or should I really make a point of saying to the person, I'm sorry I have to say this to you?
Well, first, I can't answer what's right for you, Wes. I think it makes an awful lot of sense as a white person to make sure that the person to whom you're going to say this knows that this is not in your regular vernacular, that this is not how you speak, it's not how you think, it's not who you are, because there's no way for people to know otherwise. So I think taking the time to do that and establishing a relationship is a wise move. I think it's an empathetic move, and I think it helps make it easier for the person who has to receive that word coming at them to be able to receive it and not take it personally in any way, shape, or form.
Good, thank you. Well, that's what I thought, and I'm happy to hear you confirm that. So thanks a lot.
Happy to help, Wes. All right, Jennifer, I think it's back to a question from you.
Yes, and I want to just point out, I popped into the chat. If you're able to see the chat, there's the implicit bias test from Harvard, and it covers a variety of different blind spots. And it's pretty interesting to discover where those blind spots are for ourselves, where those hidden biases are in ourselves. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about yourself, I would encourage you to test that out, the Harvard link. How about, Betty, this is one of the first questions we chatted about when we were talking about the program. When did you first experience racism?
That's such a weird question because most people have a very different response than I have. I would say I had one example of racism in college. I was driving on the 405, speeding, which is the only way to drive on the 405 if you've been to California. And I was in the far left lane because I like to go fast, and the car stopped working. And so I had to try and get it over to the right, to where you pull over. And I was having trouble because the car was stopping working. And someone drove past and said, "Learn how to drive, you N-word." So that was I just literally cried. That was a tremendous and hurtful thing. But that was like a one-off, and it was like a driving road rage thing. So I didn't really take it very seriously. Oddly enough, for those of you all who have been here in Colorado for a while, my dose of racism came here. I moved here 7 years ago, full grown, and experienced discrimination and racism like I'd never experienced before in my life. I grew up through middle school in Miami. I went to high school in Atlanta. I went to college in Los Angeles. Then I came back to Atlanta for 2 years, and then I went to London, and then I came back, and then I stayed in Atlanta until I moved here. And I had to instead discover racism and discrimination in Colorado. So, crazy things from audience members shaking the hands of other cast members and then attempting to pat me on the head. Lest you think, oh, is it because she's bald? No, had hair down to my butt. They were still trying to pat me on the head, and I had to do matrix moves to get out of the way. I had any number of things that have happened here in Colorado among liberal, intelligent, artistic people. Yeah, in Denver and in Boulder, the cities that can't possibly have that. Yeah, that's where I experienced most of my racism and discrimination. And it made me settling into Colorado. It took a long time. It took 4 years of my 7 years before I knew I could actually stay. I stayed on the fence because that was my experience constantly amongst intellectual circles. Yeah. You're on mute, Ms. Jen. Thanks, Christine.
Thank you. We have AJ raised his hand.
Oh, cool. So my next question is, with everything that's happened this year, but not limited to everything that's happened this year, some of my friends who have checked in just to see if I'm alive have asked, should I be doing that? Is that am I blowing up your phone? Am I just kind of distracting you from whatever you would like to be doing in your life? Or is, what would my response to them was like, I'm glad you were just curious. But, and some people I'm curious why, my authoritative figures to me have not asked, but I don't know if that's my place to be like, is this a bias or a specific perspective? What do you think of that?
Yeah, AJ, it's a great question. I will say that my answer to that has changed from, the murder of George Floyd to now, simply because there was no way for me to recognize how much fear was in the white community. I could never imagine that people who had been friends with me for years, who knew me, who I knew, could possibly be afraid to ask how I was doing. So here's a very odd thing that happened, and you might have noticed it when I posted on Facebook. A friend of mine in Atlanta wrote one night, close to midnight, about some horrible experiences he had because he had said nothing at first because he had been told, you're white, you need to step back, and he's a white male, you need to be silent. And so he said nothing when everything went down. And then another person a week later said, I can't believe you're silent. I thought you cared. What's up with that? And so he was in this deep crisis because he said, some people told me not to talk, and then another person's accusing me of being racist because I'm not talking. What am I supposed to do? And so I simply wrote this response to him publicly, right? And it just basically said, you do what's in your heart. If it's in your heart to speak up, then speak up. Know that people want to hear it. People need to hear it. It's important. You're actually going to be making a difference for more than just a few friends. And then I gave him like a series of different ways of coming at it. And it was just a little Betty I didn't spend any time thinking. This was just me talking off the top of my head. And the next morning, a lot of his friends who I did not know had liked it. And I was like, oh, do people need permission to know it's okay? So then I kind of took part of that and I created a post and I just said, hey, to all my white friends out there, if you're worried about not checking on your friends of color because you're scared, please know that your heart speaks and we want to hear from you and it's okay. And I gave him like potential sample language. Like it was just this thing. And AJ, I promise you, I again, I didn't spend a lot of time on this. It was just me talking to people. And then like 300 people liked it and like 200 people responded. And then suddenly my messenger was blowing up and my texts were blowing up and my email. And I was like, oh my God, people, I wasn't needing anything, but people wanted to connect and to respond and to know that it was okay, that I wasn't going to blast them because they wanted to check in. So I think it's really hard because, in the same way that we don't know what it's like for them and they don't know what it's like for us, I think there's a lot of fear. And so I think letting your friends know that it's welcome for you is helpful. I have other friends who like maybe in the beginning, they were like, oh, one check-in was nice. But then like when the 50th friend, they were like, you're triggering me, people. I'm just trying to get through my day. So, I think it's personal and I think it's individual and I think it's tricky. I didn't expect anyone to check on me and I was very surprised. I mean, I was moved, but I was really surprised because I was like, do I seem like I need help? But the bottom line is that people wanted to give support. And I wanted my friends to know that my friends are always my friends. And I'll tell you, a friend of mine who I've been friends with for 20 years texted me and said, I love you. And we had literally talked like 2 weeks before the murder of George Floyd. And so I texted him back and I said, I know, I love you too. What's up? And he was like, well, with everything going on, I just needed you to know. And I was like, thank you. And nothing that happened there has anything to do with us. We've been walking together for 20 years. And he was like, oh, thank God. Right. And that was somebody who knows me, someone who lived in my house. You know what I mean? Like someone who we have deep, deep relationship, but he was still scared that because the whole country had changed, that it could possibly affect who we are together.
And Betty, I just want to jump in. We had 2 callers hop on, and I would love to plug in a first name for each of you, if that would make you feel more welcome, callers. Feel free to unmute yourself. I think it's *6 if you're on the phone. I can't remember. Or I can unmute you if you'd like to introduce yourself just with a name is fine. Or if you'd like to remain anonymous, that's fine too. So just want to put that out there. And then I do see that Kira has her hand up. And so we can go ahead and
awesome. And then after Kira, we need to go to Liz's and Gia's questions.
Yes, we absolutely do.
So sorry to correct you. The correct pronunciation of my name is Kyra.
Kyra. Don't be
Kyra,
sorry,
I should
Kyra.
know that because, we go way back to all those library conferences. So I apologize for that.
It's okay. I'm just returning from Colorado. I moved away for a year to Portland, Oregon, and I'm recently back. But I did see Liz's question in the chat, and I did want to give an example. So before I left and came back to Colorado, I have been in Colorado for probably close to 20 years. And so the example that I'm going to give is like pre-George Floyd, and other things. So there was one morning, it was one evening, I was on my way home from work. And at the time I worked 2 jobs. So I worked about 30 hours at a library, at a public library during the day. And then at night I had a security job, which I worked from like 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. So I was getting off from the second job, and it was a cold and snowy night, and I got pulled over by a cop, and I noticed that he was outside of his jurisdiction. At the time, I worked in Douglas County, and I live in Aurora. And so I noticed that the officer that pulled me over happened to be from Douglas County. So my radar went off. I'm like, why am I being pulled over? And I'm being pulled over by a cop outside of his jurisdiction. For anyone who's familiar with the Colorado area, the metro area anyway, you will know that Douglas County is at least 20 minutes or more from Aurora, probably closer to 30 with no traffic. And when he made the stop, it was below zero, and he asked me to leave my windows down while he checked my plates. And when I asked why I was being pulled over, and I was really close to my house, really close, he said I had turned into the wrong lane. And he's like, what are you doing out at this hour? And I said, well, I actually have 2 jobs. I'm on my way home from the second job. And he gave me a warning. But for me, I could not help but sit there and think in that stop, if I were a different ethnicity, I would not have had to, leave my window down when it's 0 degrees outside during winter. And I probably wouldn't have been stopped by someone outside of the jurisdiction. So what I ended up doing was I ended up filing a complaint, and I was so happy that I made the choice to file the complaint. Ordinarily, I'm not a complainer. I'll just try and let things roll off. But I was like, there's no reason for the stop, and I didn't even get a ticket. He let me off with a warning. I'm like, but that stop took 20 minutes, and I was an icicle by the time I drove down the street to get to my townhome. Mm. And that's an example of, driving while Black, because that's what it is. For me, I'm multiracial. I'm part Black and I'm part Asian. In the part of town that I live in, it's not unusual to see both of us. In Aurora, great restaurants, ethnic markets, etc. It's part of the reason why I live over there. But at the same time, I was like, this isn't right. And there was no reason. I had no broken taillight, current registration, didn't make any false traffic moves. And I knew that if I were of another ethnicity, I would not have gotten pulled over. And so I took it as an opportunity to advocate for myself. What that officer did not realize, and I did not share it with him, was because of work at the library, I actually knew the sheriff at the time. And so he actually did get a reprimand, because the sheriff shared with me later when we saw each other. He's like, yeah, I heard about one of my officers being outside of jurisdiction. And we weren't aware of that, and he shouldn't have been there. And I was like, oh, but if I wouldn't have had that relationship, he wouldn't have been willing to even say something to me and follow up with me. But that relationship took years to build. Hmm. So, and that was pre-COVID. I'm sorry, that was pre-COVID. That was pre-George Floyd. I mean, I have no idea what it's like now, coming back into Colorado into these new set of circumstances. So I think that'll be interesting to see too, because, I mean, not only did we have George Floyd, we had Elijah McCain as well. And it's proof that you can try and do all the things right, but that doesn't necessarily ensure that there's going to be a safe outcome.
Thank you, Kyra. Yeah. Liz, you asked for another example. I will tell you, this one's kind of fun to talk about, but it was pretty horrific at the time. I was doing a show at Curious called Good People, and my best friend Tasha came into town to see me. And at the time, I had long locks. She had long locks. And so, but she and I don't look alike in any way. That's the only thing we have in common. And so at the theater, during intermission, someone approached her and said, "You must know Betty." And because my friend is both brilliant and part evil, she immediately said, "No, but you must." And then the person went, "What?" She said, "Well, if you assumed I knew her, you must know her." And the person was like, no. So that happened. Then before I went to do the show, I was looking for a gym. And I had heard amazing things about the Colorado Athletic Club. And so I had spoken on the phone to a person who had given me great information. And I told her that I wanted to come visit. And I told her I was going to come visit on it that Saturday. And she said, "Oh, well, I won't be working. But you know what? Anyone can show you, can do the tour, take the tour on Saturday. And then I'll call you on Monday and find out how it went." And I said, "Great." And so we showed up. And the person made us wait, even though we were going to go see a movie in between. And we'd said, we only have a certain amount of time. And it started off badly because he came up and he was like, "Hey, I hear you guys are going to see a movie." And we were like, "Yes." And he goes, "Well, I hope it's not one of those movies where actors get paid way too much to do voiceover." Well, I'm an actor. So yeah. And I was actually going to see an animated film. So that wasn't good. It wasn't a good start, but that's not anything big. It's just his point of view. And so we were like, fine. And so we start going on the tour and he stops at the daycare and he says, "So I want to make sure you all know that you can drop off your kids." Tasha nor I have kids. So that was a weird moment, but okay, maybe because we're women, he just made an assumption. Okay. So then we start doing the tour and we could see from the window that there was a pool. And Tasha and I are both from beach worlds and we love to swim. And so we asked about the pool and he said, "Oh, no, you don't need to worry about that. You don't swim." And then he followed that illustrious statement with, "But there's a pickup game that happens every Monday. So now we play basketball, but we don't swim." And then I'm a big Pilates and exercise class person. So I was really wanting to see that. He didn't want to show me because he didn't think it was interesting to me. And so just over the course of a 15-minute tour, he's probably said 7 to 10 things that were all microaggressions to completely macroaggressions. Tasha is wonderful. And she is the kind of friend who will, cuss someone out on your behalf. That's my girl. I don't do that. And so the whole time I'm looking at her please don't say anything. Just let us get out of here. Let us get out of here. And so we leave and I wanted to make excuses. I was like, "Well, maybe." And she was like, Really? And I was like, "Well, but the person I've been talking to isn't like that. She's wonderful." And so Tasha, of course, immediately quit back. "Does she know you're Black?" I was like, "Well, I don't know." And she's like, "Uh-huh." So that Monday, the woman from there called to see how it went. And I began to recount to her what had happened. And halfway through the call, it occurred to me, I heard Tasha's voice in my head, "Does she know you're Black?" And I went, "Oh, right. I don't sound quote unquote Black. So I suppose I have to reveal this to her." And so halfway through the call, I said, "Perhaps to put this in greater context, I might need to mention that I'm African American." And she gasped. And she was horrified. And then as she heard the rest of the things, she completely saw it in the exact same light that Tasha did, of just offense after offense after offense. And she did a lot to try to make it better and to do repair. But Tasha had literally made me promise, because she knows that sometimes I'm a people pleaser. And she was like, if you ever go to that gym again, we will never be friends. So it didn't matter what she was offered. I couldn't say yes, because my friendship with Tasha mattered more. But that's an example. Those are just some examples of what happened. It's kind of ridiculous. And yet it happened. But there's more. I mean, that's plenty. Gia asked, how do you defend or discern when someone says, and Gia, that's exactly how they say it, wow, you're so articulate. It's a really hard question for me, because I've come to recognize that I am a gifted speaker. So giving you a compliment shouldn't be a negative, right? Like, I have to put that out there, because some of you go, yeah. But it's the how they say it that kind of gives the clue. So if you just heard me speak and you're like, wow, you're a really powerful speaker, thank you. It's if instead you just go, wow, you speak so well, then it opens the doors. It implies that apparently you thought I couldn't or wouldn't, and you have some reasoning behind that. And so then that's where it's definitely a pejorative. It's definitely a negative. And then it's like, suddenly, oh, why? Why did you presume that I wouldn't be able to speak well? Do we not all speak well here? And that's where I usually have some fun with it. But yeah, articulate is a buzzword that people will often say to people of color, which means to them, I am happy you speak so well, and I'm surprised because you're a person of color. And one of the questions that I ask my friends whenever, or anyone who says that to me, is I'll say, how often have you used that phrase to someone who's not a person of color? And if they look or pause or get that, big eyes, then we know that we're onto something, because there's a number of people who speak well. But if you've never used the word articulate with a white person, why are you using it with a person of color? Would be the kind of question that I have with people, Gia. And it does become problematic for me in particular, because I am a speaker and people say I speak well. So I do get the challenge in that, but it's about the digging deeper about why are they saying that phrase as opposed to well-spoken or like any number of things, but it's in how you say it. And I don't know, I just think that after you've heard it enough and you've heard someone go up to Hillary and say, nice job today, and then they go up to AJ and say, oh, you're so well-spoken, it begins to kind of get the clue that there's a difference in how they're perceiving and that it's supposed to be the same compliment, but it's not. It just isn't.
All right, Kathy. Yeah, we've got a hand raised from AJ.
Oh, yeah, let's do AJ and then we'll go to Kathy.
Yes.
All right. Thank you for your stories, and I will keep mine brief. I'm not above unfriending, blocking, whatever. Like, I truly believe that everybody who's in my quote unquote friends list on Facebook or social media is somebody that I've met and somebody that I've had, or I'm not going to say that, but people that I've met in person and have made an understanding that they are people who can handle a disagreement. And so these are the people who are too far gone. If I see or hear something from somebody who is unaware of has made it my responsibility to tell them what goes on in my life by the wrong things that they say, and they refuse to understand that, or they refuse to say that they are not damaging any person of color by the things that they say or do. These are just people who are too far gone. I have been told to let it go, put my energy elsewhere. Where do you put your energy? Where do you go? Like, I truly am. I'm a people pleaser. I am too adamant about not keeping my friends, but you're already my friend. How can, obviously if you're a stranger, all right, go on with your day. But I've made not years, but maybe like a couple of days of connection with you. And I truly believe that your perspective is built off of something that you've gone through, but it's wrong. In my perspective, I mean, it is. And how do I get that to you? And if I can't get that to you, where do I put my energy? Where do I just breathe and go on to? Like, that's truly my concerns.
Okay, there were a lot of questions in there,
Yeah,
AJ. So let me make sure that I'm hearing them. I heard one, where do I put my energy, right? So when this offensive thing has happened, this hurtful thing has happened, kind of what do I do with it? That seems to be one question. There also seems to be the question that seems a little similar to Liz's of how do we wake people up? Is that part of your question as well?
Sure, yes.
Okay, so what do you do with all this energy? How do you wake people up? And I almost heard like a third one of, is it okay to cut someone off or to unfriend them? Is that also a part of what you're asking?
I don't necessarily need to know if it's okay. These are people that I'll see they're in my life. I'll see again. How do I deal with that?
Okay, great. Nothing hard there, AJ. Thanks.
Yeah.
I'll start with the energy one because it's personal. I think the key to being able to navigate the space in terms of how do you, not just with them, but just for yourself, is that you have to acknowledge to yourself what happened, right? I was hurt. This blindsided me. I was stunned. Whatever that is, owning it, saying it out loud, whether you're saying it to someone else or not, allowing yourself to process that is really important. I think a lot of people try to bury it, and they say that, microaggressions is kind of like dying a death from 1,000 paper cuts. 1,000 paper cuts hurts. Right? Maybe the first one didn't hurt intensely, but it hurt. And this idea of allowing them to continue is a lot of pain that a person would be carrying around. So I think it's really important to acknowledge the pain, acknowledge that it hurts, acknowledge that you don't know how to deal with all of that. That's like the beginning, right? It's the beginning of it. Dr. Dan Siegel says, name it to tame it, that when you actually speak what's happening in your body, you actually allow your brain to begin to calm down so that when you say, I'm stressed, I'm hurt, I'm angry, you actually give your brain the ability to actually secrete chemicals inside you that actually help you to calm yourself. So naming it is really important. That's the first part. Navigating, continuing to walk alongside or have to work in our industry. There's so many people and having to work with them again. That's a trickier thing. And I think it's up to you about how you decide to go about it. If you call that person a friend and you'd like them to remain your friend, then some conversation has to happen so that there is potential for repair. I think one of the things that I've seen a lot of my friends of color do is say, well, they should have known, in the same way that when people are in relationships with their significant other, they have this magic idea that because the person cares, they're supposed to know. I don't know why any of us have this thought that someone else is supposed to know how we think or feel. But the truth is no one can know unless we tell them. And so the question is, how do you tell them, or will you tell them, or when will you tell them? I find again that telling a person when I'm highly emotionally charged isn't necessarily the way to have a productive conversation because I'm charged. And so now anything's going to set me off because I haven't dealt with my stuff, right? And I'm going to make it about you, but it's really about me. So if I take the time where I'm back in a better place, a centered, neutral, grounded, loving space, then I can say to you, hey, I'd like to have a conversation with you about something that happened. Is now a good time? I'm a really big believer in asking people about time. And I say that as somebody who is famous for not doing it. Like, I love to dive in. That's me. Like, if it were up to me, we wouldn't do any pleasantries on the phone. I literally would say hello and just tell you what I want or why I'm calling. Like, that's me. But people need pleasantries, I've learned. And so you have to do that. And so asking someone, is this a good time, actually allows them to actually have some agency in this. You're not just putting something on them. Because if they are already in a bad space about something else, that's not a time for them to enter into the conversation. So actually doing that allows for both people to be in a positive or neutral headspace instead of in a negative space, and then being able to say it. And I think the key is, the stuff that everyone's always told you, speak in I statements. It's really hard to disagree with I. It's super easy to disagree with you. So if I look, and I say, Michael, I was hurt when you said blank, then Michael has options. Michael can say, well, wait, what do you mean you were hurt? And what did I say? And what, first, Michael may not even have any memory of this, right? So he might need to ask some questions. It also gives him a chance to begin to process. He might say, oh, well, I'm really sorry. That wasn't my intention. And that then you can have amazing conversations about the difference between intent and impact. Because someone's intention may have been good, but the impact that they left was devastating. And letting someone know that can then change the game. And I find that a lot of people kind of get stuck with, but their intentions were good. Well, if I smack you across the face and I said I was doing it because I'm taking a cardio boxing class, okay, that doesn't change the fact that you've got, something on your cheek. So we have to deal with the impact, and that's the part that we share, versus the intent, which is where someone might have been coming from. And so then in terms of navigating with other people, I would say you have to decide. Are you going to have that conversation or series of conversations? Are you going to open that door? Or are you making a decision about that person and allowing your bias to now kind of move? And this is your conscious bias. And I've made a decision about this person. And now because of that, my walls are up and I will navigate with you accordingly. Those are your choices. But I think it's just worth you knowing that. Yeah. Does that answer what you asked for? And is there more now based on what I've said?
There could be so much more, but you did answer what what I asked. Thank you.
Thank you, AJ. Kyra.
AJ, I just wanted to share something with AJ, because one of the things that really resonated with me that you said, and I self-describe as being a recovering people pleaser. So there's a book that I'm going to share with you. I've already looked, and unfortunately, Jefferson County Libraries does not own it, but it is a book that's called The Power of No. And let me read the subtitle: Because One Little Word Can Bring Health, Abundance, and Happiness. It's by James Altucher, Altucher. Arapahoe Libraries does have it, but I have reread and revisited that book because no is a sentence. It's empowering, it's self-protecting. It is. And it is a way to get out of people pleasing, because the trap is that you fall into feeling guilty for wanting to please everyone, and you cannot please everyone. It is literally impossible. And so it kind of forces you to have to put your own needs first. And for me, particularly when you're talking about like racial interactions, this is about preserving Black dignity. This is about preserving your own self-worth and dignity. So please don't be afraid to say no, to not invite toxic energy into your life from people that are bringing it in. Sometimes you may just have to disconnect from them temporarily. It doesn't have to be permanent. You can always revisit things, and that supports a lot of things that Betty said. But really, it's about self-care and self-protection. So I would encourage you to read that book if you can get your hands on it. I've done it as an audiobook, and the narrators are great. And I revisit that book. I try to revisit that book once every 2 years. So I don't get too lax in not setting boundaries to protect myself.
Thank you, Kyra.
Because you're going to be happier if you do that.
Thank you.
And I will look into why we don't have it at the Jefferson County Public Library.
I knew you were going to say that, Jennifer. You're like, what? I'm going to fix it. So Kathy asked a really great question that I think we should dive into. And so she said, as a white person, if I were to say the same thing happened to me, I was pulled over by an out of jurisdiction cop, et cetera, or you're quite articulate or other stereotypes, am I being dismissive of the incidents? How do we navigate situations where the same thing could happen to all races? And Kathy, I want to make sure I'm understanding your question. So if you're willing to come on, I want to just hear from you. Is your question that the things that we've named as discriminatory could happen to anyone? And so does it matter if you don't take those things seriously? Is that your question? I just want to make sure I'm answering the right question.
Yes, that's the question. I don't want to be dismissive of any, and I just use those because they're in front of me and those are the examples. It could be anywhere, right? Any example. But I sometimes don't want to take it lightly, but yet it's an incident or an event that could happen to any person of any race. But then does that make it dismissive because I'm white? And if it is any race, it could be me, it could be, and so it's sometimes that's hard to navigate, I think, because, I could name off the top of my head many, many times when by what maybe I look like or some of my siblings that I have been with, it's like, oh, you should be out there playing basketball, or where are your kids, and same type of things, that the stereotype, but when is that race and when is it not? And that's a big question.
It's a great question, Kathy. And it allows me to kind of go into this thing that I probably should have gone in if we had planned it when I talked about bias earlier. When I mentioned that we all have bias, that really was to open the door to the fact that the reality is anyone can be discriminated against by any number of things. That's fact. And as we have the conversation about race, that can kind of get lost sometimes. So I definitely appreciate you bringing this up. People can be discriminated against for any of the isms, right? Yes. Sexism still exists. Homophobia still exists. There's all of those things, right? So yes, you can be discriminated against. And yes, those things can happen to you and not be discriminatory, right? If indeed you were driving the speed limit and you were doing everything right and a cop pulled you over, that would be curious. Yes. Data says it doesn't happen as much, Kathy. That's what the data says. And so that's where you begin to be able to say, is it racially motivated? It's about the data. So the fact is, in jail, we have a disproportionate number of people who are people of color. Why is that? Right. When the majority of drug incidents are actually perpetrated by people who are white. Interesting. Why is it that a white person gets off with a slap and a black person has to have jail time? You could say, but they both were arrested. I would say to you, why then are so many white people being let go? I would say to you that the reason for that is because of the systemic racist practices of our country, and because the systems were indeed designed to benefit some and to hurt others. So in terms of the implicit question you have of, are you being dismissive of the incidents? Maybe. I don't know you. I can't answer for you. But what I can say is that it's very hard to fully comprehend the lived experiences of others. And so what I would encourage you to do is ask questions rather than decide you're the expert based on your own life. Because that's the challenge, that if I look at AJ, because I'm not a black male, and let me be very clear, the discrimination I've experienced in Colorado pales in comparison to every black person I know in Colorado, what they've experienced. I have experienced so little comparatively. The fact that I've lived my entire adult life without discrimination just goes ahead and puts me in a whole other category. Do you know what I mean? I have to acknowledge that. The fact that my experiences with the police are nothing like some of my friends. Nothing. I've had police flirt with me, apologize to me, be kind to me. Those are my experiences. Nothing like many of my friends. So I think the key is, it would be wrong of me to say to my black male friends who have a very different experience with the police, oh, I'm sure you didn't mean it. Oh, come on. I could do that, but it would be really insensitive and not recognizing that things do happen differently based on how we look, based on how we present, and all of those other things. Does that help?
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. Yeah, definitely.
Okay, thank you.
So, and Kathy, I was just going to chime in a little bit here and say, my spouse is white, and unless you have encounters where you are hanging out with Black people,
Quite often I
socially,
do. Quite often.
Sometimes it's not as evident, because even my husband and I have had sensitive conversations, or there have been times where we've been together and we've been pulled over. There was one time we were on our way home and I made the mistake. There was a cop that had pulled up beside us and decided to pull the car over. And after that particular police stop, my husband was like, wow, I didn't understand some of the things that you were talking about, because when we got pulled over, the officer actually came up on my side of the vehicle, even though my husband was the one that was driving, and I started verbally engaging with the officer, and the officer said, I'm not talking to you, and redirected.
No, I've had it happen where I've been with a Black male in the car. I know what you're talking about, but I wanted to bring the question up because I think and that wasn't, I only use that example because you had talked about it. So I wanted to make it clear that it's any incident where it could happen to any race. I just want to make sure that I'm not being dismissive of that. I have been where you've been. I've been pulled over for no reason. But I've also been in a car with a Black male and been pulled over, the same thing. So I've been on both sides, but also I still question myself too as well, that, okay, this happened to me, this has happened to them, this has happened here, this has happened there. I have the same stereotype. I get the sexism, but is it racism or is it sexism? I didn't want to be dismissive at all with anybody because I have a large group of friends that of all races. And it's hard.
And I was going to say, and I just want to add that
I just want to pause it for a second, Kyra, because we only have 20 more minutes and I want to make sure that we're sharing the mic. So I do apologize, because I did have somebody in the chat who also wanted to speak, and we still have some other questions. So Michael, you said that you wanted to say something.
Yes, very quickly. Some of the things that I've heard this evening are, it brings up emotions whenever we have this conversation. And what I can simply say, and there's too much that's been said to try to narrow it all down to, oh, this means this means this is too much. What I simply will say is this: there are times when you're in situations as a Black man where I can be with a group of white people and something happens. You may not know how that affected me, because we do things called code switching. We do things where we act as though everything is okay. You will think everything is fine, but there's an anxiety a lot of times in us that says this could go really badly really quickly. And when you leave and I speak and say, so let's say if AJ and I were there and we're all with a whole bunch of group of white people and something happens, AJ and I would probably have a very different conversation when it's just he and I than everybody else there. So and a lot of America, a lot of society tells us to just calm down. It's okay. If you don't have anything, you have nothing to hide. If nothing is wrong, you didn't do anything, you have nothing to hide. And a lot of that stuff that we hear is not the reality of how it plays out. And so I'll simply just say that piece of it is, yeah, there are other things that happen to other people the same way it happens. Somebody got pulled over wrongly. There are white people who have been killed by the police who should not have been killed. There are Asians who've gotten killed by the police. There are people who've gotten killed by the police who should not have been killed. There's all of that. The trouble that we have is not only the disproportionate number, but the reasoning behind it. And so when someone says, and I'll stop here. When someone says, Well, everyone has. That happens here. Well, that happens there. Well, that happens here. I can understand it. However, there's a deeper meaning. There's a deeper issue that we're all the world is now beginning to wrestle with. It's because of things that happened with George Floyd. It's because of things that happened with the people who are all of the different things that are coming. There are too many names. There are too many names to try and say this is something that can just be, oh, well, it happens to everybody. No, it's not. And that's the pain. But that's all I'll say.
Thank you, Michael. All right. We have a few other questions and just a little bit of time. So Gia asked a question about microaggressions and talking to people about that. And I think it's interesting because when you talk about microaggressions, you really are covering the spectrum. Microaggressions can indeed happen to anyone. Microaggressions are often indirect, subtle, or unintentional discrimination against members of a marginalized group. What's interesting is that microaggressions show up in lots of ways. So, for example, my best friend, Tasha, happens to be a woman of size. And so the microaggression that gets said to her the most is, "You're really pretty for a big girl." That's a microaggression. It sounds like a compliment to somebody, but it's not. All of those kinds of things are microaggressions. And what's so painful and dangerous about them is, again, it's that example of the death by a 1,000 paper cuts. One here and there wouldn't be a big thing. But if you hear them all the time or every single day, it accumulates. And there's a psychological toll to that. And it's very hard to navigate. AJ asked the question about something that's overt. Microaggressions aren't overt, and that's what makes them even more troubling. So that someone else can say, "Oh, but they gave you a compliment. Come on." But the truth is, it wasn't really a full compliment. They actually insulted you for your size while telling you that you're pretty. That's not actually a compliment. So microaggressions can happen across the spectrum. They happen in the race world. The example of "you're articulate" is an example of a microaggression. "You speak so well. You speak so clearly." Yeah, that's a microaggression. "You're pretty for a fat girl, big girl." That's a microaggression. And there's lots and lots of others. I'm not going to unpack more of them, but that's the danger. And really what microaggressions show is they are a great way of showing your bias. That's what they do. They illustrate really clearly where your bias is. And again, you may not see your bias, but we can see it and we can feel it and we are impacted by it. And that we is collective we. It's not Bettys in the world. It's not Black people. It's just we, because everyone can experience microaggressions.
Hillary's got her hand up.
Awesome. Yay, go Hillary. Yeah.
I had a blind spot revealed to me last night in a group that I was learning from. And the blind spot had to do, and always so many being revealed all the time. These two African-American women were discussing the.
Oh, you went on mute, Hillary. We lost you right after "these two African-American were."
That's all I was going to say. So they were discussing the fact that they are going to be in their house and be super careful after Election Day for up to a week. And they were discussing that they're already planning for that. And I had no idea. It hadn't. And then I'm like, wow, that hadn't even occurred to me. And this is in Denver. My question is how to be an ally. How?
I love that question, Hillary. There's a lot of different things to do to be an ally. The number one way to be an ally is to do the research. Don't expect other people to educate you. I know that's weird. Like, you came here perhaps to be educated, and that's not bad, but it means that your chief source of education shouldn't be this. It's doing the work. It's reading. It's watching. It's doing all of that. So that's the number one thing you could do to be an ally. The second thing is to make a decision as an ally that you are going to be an ally, which means you're going to speak up despite the comfort. A lot of people want to be allies on social media. A lot of people want to be social media activists. They've got amazing things to say on social media, but in the real world, they say nothing. I will posit this question to you that may have occurred to some of you as you watched George Floyd be murdered right before our eyes on camera. I asked myself the question of, for all the people who spoke up, what would have happened if any of them had decided to get up and actually confront the police, right? There were more bystanders than there were police. What would have happened if someone had simply gotten into his space and given George a chance to breathe? What might have happened if the allyship was stronger than this, I'm just going to film it and I'm going to say things from the sidelines? So allyship is about speaking up, period, when things are wrong. Allyship is about talking to someone who you love and respect and saying, I love and respect you, and yet I want to bring to your attention that what you said was offensive or wrong or racist or blankist, and here's why. Those are concrete, tangible things you can do as an ally. It means you don't have the right to be silent anymore. Allies choose to speak over being silent, and allies are willing to listen to the people of color as opposed to deciding that they should tell them how it feels. One of the biggest challenges in the movement is having white people decide what racial justice looks like without talking to the people who are actually being oppressed. It's a curiosity. So all of those are things that would actually make allyship. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah. And I was even thinking, yes. And specifically with people in homes. So speaking up about it, if people are, loudly calling in the attention to it. Yes.
Right? Yeah. Great question. Thank you. There's a lot of stuff in the chat. Catherine, thank you, Betty, AJ, Kyra, and everyone for sharing your experiences. Awareness and education are key, meaning taking the initiative to educate ourselves. Everyone should read, totally agree. White Fragility by Dr. Robin DiAngelo. And so you want to talk about race? Yes. And this is a good article mentioning numbers. I love it. Awesome. Thanks, Catherine. I appreciate that. I love you guys are flooding the chat with great books. New Jim Crow is fantastic. Cast is a great book. I mean, there's so many. That's fantastic. All right, we've got 10 minutes left. So either Jennifer or someone else have a good question that you want to ask.
So I think AJ actually popped something into the chat. It got, chat's blowing up. Thank you guys. I love this. But it was up in here. How do you navigate a racial debate when a person of color might be saying something factually correct, but are in the right, I'm not sure if I'm saying this right, but are in the right to be upset?
Factually incorrect, but are in the right to be upset.
Okay.
Okay, say it again, AJ.
So if I'm in a gathering of racial debate and there are people of color who are triggered, charged, rightfully, but they are
factually
just saying incorrect, saying things not true, to kind of plead their case or to kind of
win.
Exactly. Yeah. How do I navigate that? How do you navigate?
Well, first off, how about we don't have racial debates? So that's kind of step one. I don't really think a lot of successful things can happen during them. That being said, I do love having conversations about race and sometimes they get heated. I would say if someone is in a heated or charged place, chances are high they're not going to be able to hear me giving them facts because they're in a charged place. So chances are, until there's some calming down, I'm not going to attempt because it's not going to be received. But that's just me, because I'm just looking at the humanity of it, right? So I might say, it sounds like we might need to take a breather. Can we all take a walk and come back to this? There's something you said I really want to talk to you about, but not right now. I might plant that seed, but not fully engage, because if people are charged, and rightfully so, I don't see how a fact is going to change anything in that moment. Ruth, as a Black woman, hearing hurtful remarks from white people I work with on a daily basis and have known for over 15 years and considered my friend is extremely hurtful. For example, I was traveling for business with a white colleague last year, and she was not familiar with a parking procedure. And I mentioned to her to ask someone, and she mentioned if they call the authorities, they will arrest you before me. This was extremely hurtful, especially since she said it before all my white team. they were offended. And when I told her privately, she blew it off as a joke. How do we move on from someone who does not truly acknowledge my feelings or apologize? Woo! All right, let's have the heaviest stuff at the end. Thank you, Ruth. That's really hard. 15 years of letting it go is really hard. So to ask you, how do you continue to move on from someone like that? I guess I would ask the question, why do you need to move on? Right? It feels like for 15 years, you've been working alongside that person and obviously, you know, probably doing it in a very civil and polite and professional way. I think if you told the person based on what you said here and they blew it off as a joke, you know, I think it's up to you about what you want to do about it. The bottom line is we can't control anyone but ourselves, right? That's the hard truth. We can't control anyone but ourselves, and some of us barely control ourselves. And so if you've told someone that they've harmed you and they said it was a joke, they blew it off as a joke, and then you told them a second time, perhaps in that calm place where no one was emotionally charged, and they still refuse to acknowledge anything happened or even to apologize just because of human to human, they didn't want to offend you. I think those are the times when sometimes you have to cut some losses and move people. You know, compartmentalization is a protective measure sometimes. And so sometimes we have to just say, okay, that is a work colleague. And for work purposes, I will do the following. But outside of that, there's nothing there. That's hard. 15 years is hard. So let me just say to you, I am really sorry that has been happening and happening on an ongoing basis. I cannot imagine the mortification of having someone just blurt out, oh, they'll arrest you before me. All of that is wrong. I would encourage you to write a letter or an email, just helping that person to see. They may not choose to do anything with it, but at least you can know beyond a shadow of a doubt that you were clear, that you brought it to their attention, and maybe this will help somebody else down the road, even if it doesn't help you.
And Michael had asked to say something. So Michael, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself?
If I can figure out how to work this thing, yeah, sure. Okay. Last quick thing, and this kind of goes back to exactly what you were saying, Betty, but also I wanted to address something that AJ was asking earlier. My father, and I'll make it quick, my father walked with King, and he had meetings with Dr. King and meetings with all the people, Abernathy, all of those names. And in one particular meeting that they were having about, was the meeting before the march on Washington. And there was a discussion in the room. Why are we doing this? Why are we, some people were like, we're upset. We need to embarrass the police. We need to embarrass everybody that's out there. We need to let them know that we're not going to take this anymore. We're fighting for this. And there was another consensus was, if we do this way, we're not going to be able to have the march. And I'm shortening all of this as much as I can. The bottom line is this, is when you have a disagreement in the room, you've got to get back to the purpose of the discussion. If you can't do that, then it's not worth having the discussion. If you've got to get back to the purpose of why you're there, the real purpose of why you're there. If there is no way for us to actually talk about the ultimate goal, the ultimate good of what we're doing, then the discussion becomes more of a discussion of vengeance, of anger, of frustration, as opposed to what's going to build us, what's going to bring us together. What is the purpose of us doing this? Nothing that but the saddest part about all this stuff is that no one is asking to be placed over anybody. It's human rights, the right to exist, the right to not be afraid, the right to actually have the same things happen for all people. And if we can't get to that point without, acknowledging our anger, yes, but without staying a victim to the anger, then we can't really move beyond that and have a real good discussion. But that's what allowed them, that going back to the original purpose of why they were there, allowed them to come back to that place where they could talk about it. And the March on Washington happened. That's a story that my dad tells me. He was in the room when it happened. Hamilton, thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Well, we are minutes away from our 90-minute time together. And I just kind of want to have a few last words and then toss it to Jennifer to make any final speeches about how amazing Jeffco Library is, perhaps. I want to thank you all for coming into this space. For those of you who spoke out loud, for those of you who wrote in the chat, for those of you who simply listened intently, all of those are forms of participation, and I honor all of them. And I thank you very, very sincerely. It's one of the things that Jennifer and I decided when we were talking about this is that we weren't going to give you the spiel in the beginning. And one of the things that the spiel always says is, hey, in 90 minutes, we're not going to cure racism, right? We're not going to solve everything in 90 minutes. The problem was longer. It was here for past 90 minutes. We can't solve it all in 90 minutes. And so I think it's always worth saying, if you walked away with more questions than answers, good. If you didn't, also good. I think the key really is for each and every one of us to continually check our heart space. And I think it's important to note that the reason we talked about bias, and I didn't go deep dive in it at all, is that the bias that you know that you have makes up the 20% of the bias that's inside of you. The bias that I know that I have is only 20% of the bias that I know of. The rest, 80% of my bias and your bias and our bias is unconscious. And it's acting on us and we don't know it. Thus, Wes can say earlier, I don't want to use the N-word. It makes me uncomfortable and awkward. And I do all of this work to help this person know this. And he could say something that's racially offensive. Both things can be true. Because the conscious part of him would never do it, but the unconscious part could. And so that's part of why Jennifer put in the chat for you to go ahead and go and just Google Harvard bias test or unconscious bias and take the over 13 different tests and discover things about yourselves. Because it is possible, and it actually happens, that what you say you believe is the opposite of what you do. That's part of the challenge. And so I just want you to know that you can firmly believe in women's rights and discriminate against women. You can do both. You can be a woman and have unconscious bias about your own gender. You can have it. Like, that is the complexity of us as humans. So that's why it's such a deep topic and it's why it's so hard. And if you're just starting the journey, welcome. Thank you. Yay. And no, it's going to take time. Time to process, time to understand. And just reading a book doesn't mean you're going to get it. You actually do need to talk to people. And Kyra's experience can be completely different from my experience, which can be completely different from Michael's or Ruth's or AJ's. And they're all true, right? And so that's also the thing. You might want to say, well, based on my friend, they said, and that means everything else is true for everyone else. No, just like no 10 Coloradans are the same is true as you open it up to race. So know that it's deeper, know that it's hard, but I welcome you on the journey and check in with your friends of color and see if they want to have the conversation. Some do, some don't. You just never know until you ask. But I am just deeply honored that you all chose to spend 90 minutes of your time, that you thought enough to come and have this conversation and that you were so engaged. So just know that it was my deep honor and my privilege to be here today. Jennifer?
Yeah, Betty's a tough act to follow, obviously. But I just want to thank you all for making space for this conversation. And we will continue to have these conversations. So we're going to offer different opportunities each month. I do encourage you to reach out to me directly at the library if you have ideas of future conversations, because, there's 12 months in a year, so we can have lots of different conversations. I'm really excited that everyone participated and was so engaged. It really was, it was above and beyond what I could possibly imagine. And I already thought it was going to be fabulous. So thank you to everyone who made it that way. And again, this is recorded. I'm not quite sure all the technical parts of where it's going to live, But hopefully we'll be able to share out that information, because I think somehow some maybe captured your emails. So something like that. So we will.
Yeah, Jennifer, you definitely can email everyone, because everyone who registered, you have their email address. So you have the ability to email it to them, and then they can share it to their different networks, which I think is great. Two things that I should mention. If you enjoyed hearing Hillary's great question, or you enjoyed hearing me speak, you have the opportunity to hear us. We are both two of other amazing women who are doing a TED Talk in November. So if you go to TEDx Women, TEDx Cherry Creek, you can see more about how that happens. So that is happening. And then this Friday, if you're missing a little theater in your life, I am one of 3 pretty special people who are a part of Stories on Stage. So if you go to storiesonstage.org, we are doing a Black Lives Matter Stories on Stage this Friday night. And if it turns out that you are already unavailable Friday night, you can still buy a ticket and then watch it later, because we're filming it live in a theater, but it's going to be live streamed and recorded. So you can watch it after the fact if you buy your ticket. So storiesonstage.org if you want to see me in a performance mode, perhaps. I will be reading some of Claudia Rankin's amazing poetry from Citizen. And then I'll also be reading part of John Lewis's final words, the last letter he wrote before he died. We'll be reading that, and others as well.
Wonderful. And yeah, just Google Betty Hart, and you need to follow her. She's fabulous. She's everywhere. I could jump in because I think I recognize Michael from the
Amplify series.
The Amplify series. So Thank you for joining us, Michael, and sharing your beautiful voice. And I guess, we're over time, and I could use some food and pet my cats. And thank you so much, everyone. And that's all I got. Have a wonderful night. Thank you.
Night,
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Thank you.